Welcome, everybody, to the March webinar from New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate. I am Reinmar Zeidler. I'm a member of the steering committee of the New Hampshire Network, and I'm very glad to see everyone here for this extremely relevant and topical event to mark the release just a few weeks ago of a new report from the Union of Concerned Scientists on the potential contributions of New England's offshore wind industry, which is in its infancy, but will hopefully grow soon. In December of last year, 2025, a stop work order was issued by the Department of Interior on all offshore wind leases. They said this was due to national security risks identified by the Department of Defense, recently renamed as Department of War. All of the wind projects affected had already gone through very extensive permitting and review processes, and any earlier concerns about radar clutter, meaning interference with radar signals, had actually been laid to rest, mostly by siting the turbine arrays in places where they can't interfere, and also by some technical changes. Then in January and February of this year, 2026, federal judges reversed these orders, including the order for Revolution Wind off Connecticut and Rhode Island, citing the orders as unreasonable and capricious. And then on March 17, just a few days ago, a week ago, Revolution Wind, for the first time, started delivering power. So far, so good. But for many people, the question still remains, can offshore wind help secure resiliency and affordability of the electric grid? And do we have to choose between them, between resiliency and affordability? So to help us get perspective on this question, we are very pleased to have with us the principal author of the UCS report, Union of Concerned Scientists report, Susan Muller. I will introduce her shortly, briefly, and then if we could, please put, as Susan Muller gives her presentation, please put your questions into the chat, and we will get to them. We'll leave some time at the end to get to audience questions. Susan Muller is Senior Energy Analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Before joining UCS, she worked for 10 years with the EPA as enforcement counsel, implementing coal-fired power plant enforcement strategies. She then designed and taught one of the first U.S. courses on climate law at New England Law in Boston, and then worked as a consultant for utility-scale renewables in New England, advocating for equal access for renewables to the wholesale electricity markets and the interconnection processes administered by ISO New England. So very wide perspective, wide and broad and deep experience in these matters. She's also the author of an earlier report on offshore wind in New England from 2024. So what we are looking at and hearing about today is actually an update with new data, new and improved data. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan Muller. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Reinmar and Susan and everyone else. Very happy to be here. I really appreciate you arranging this. And I will just add that you are correct. This is an updated study. We looked at the winter of 2024-25. We have recently run an even more recent update. So we looked at this past winter. So we will share that out with this group and everyone else. But the findings are very similar. So we will probably be doing this every winter. And hopefully we'll have more and more offshore wind to really show how this works in the real world. Mm-hmm. So I think I will just make sure I can share my screen.
Mm-hmm. Go for it. Go for it.
Right. Let's see. And let's see, I think we were in the middle of it. Is that showing the first slide?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So I know not everyone today is from New Hampshire, but I did sort of focus my marks on New Hampshire. I actually am coming to you from New Hampshire myself. And so how offshore wind can help New Hampshire is something I think about very often. And I will say that it is something that it's an interesting question because most of the news about offshore wind, especially in New England, is about southern New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And I think a lot of people in northern New England, but particularly New Hampshire and Vermont, have this sense that it can't benefit us just because, particularly for Vermont, they couldn't build it directly off their coast. But there's a sense that you have to build it directly off your coast for it to help. And what I hope I can make clear today is that's not how the power system works. So we can very much benefit from offshore wind in New Hampshire. So just briefly, for anyone who's not familiar with Union of Concerned Scientists, we're a national science-based organization, and we focus on putting science into action. So we try to use our research to turn it into very direct advocacy for solutions to some of the biggest problems in the world, including climate change. So I work in our climate and energy program, and my focus is on the New England power system. So this is essentially the point that I was just trying to make. This is a map of the New England power system. This is from the grid operator. The formal name for our grid operator is the Independent System Operator of New England. We generally just refer to them as ISO or ISO. So you may hear me talking about things that ISO has said, but they are essentially the ones responsible for keeping the lights on, for keeping my laptop running right now. It is plugged into the grid and all across New England. So this map shows the system the way they think about it. And you can see that state lines really do not matter that much. What matters is these multicolored lines. Those are the high voltage power lines that are moving power around the region. And the most important fact to understand when we think about can offshore wind help in New Hampshire is that all the power in New England is pooled. And so that means it's literally called the New England Power Pool. That means energy or power supply added anywhere in New England can help everywhere in New England. And so this map gives you a sense of where power is, how it can be moved around the region. And this is a very new addition to this map. It's a little hard to see, but down at the bottom, if you look, you will see two fluorescent green lines. And I should have blown this section up with an inset, but those lines are coming from the ocean. And this is brand new, really. We have not seen this before. You can see one is connecting into the Cape in Massachusetts and one's connecting into Rhode Island. These are the power lines that are delivering energy from the Vineyard Wind and Revolution Wind. And this is actually just a fantastic time to be holding this webinar because Revolution Wind just sent its first power, as Reinmar mentioned, this month. And so that's the fluorescent green line on the lower left there. So that is feeding power into the grid as we speak. And Vineyard Wind on the same day finished construction. So we're getting a lot of energy from Vineyard, and we are getting more and more every day from Revolution Wind. So those of us who study the New England power system are just very excited about these two fluorescent green lines. So that's the big picture. And then I just want to sort of break out two pieces that I'll be talking about today. These are sort of, the technical terms, reliability and affordability. These are the things that we really want out of our power grid, right? We want the lights to stay on at the lowest possible cost. We want them to be affordable. And offshore wind can help with both of these things. there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. But the truth is that based on a lot of data and just some basic facts about the way energy works, offshore wind can help with reliability, particularly in the winter, because offshore wind is very strong in the winter, and that's when our grid is the most stressed. And it can help with affordability. Because I'm talking about our study, I'm going to be talking more about this first point of reliability, but there is a very good study out there about the impact on affordability that I will cover towards the end. But just the top line message to know is that offshore wind energy has very low operating costs, and that puts downward pressure on the market price. And there are offshore wind contract costs that are significant, but the market price is really what is driving up people's bills. So we'll come back to market prices in a minute. But I will move on now to the reliability piece. And as I mentioned, the biggest contribution that offshore wind makes to reliability is in the winter. And particularly in New Hampshire, I think everyone in northern New England sort of gets this at a gut level that if power goes out in the winter, that's a particularly serious problem. It's not just an inconvenience. It can really be a health and safety issue. So winter reliability is sort of offshore wind's greatest contribution. And our study focused on this, but we are not the only ones saying this. This is a statement from ISO New England. They made this statement immediately after the stop work order that Reinmar mentioned. And you can see that they highlighted the fact that these projects are particularly important to system reliability in the winter because offshore wind output is highest and other sources of fuel supply are constrained. So this was almost unheard of for the ISO. They are a not political organization, but for them to come out and make this statement just shows how important this power is to them and to helping them with their job of keeping the lights on. So that is, really the most authoritative statement from the grid operator. But I do want to take a moment just to help people think about this sort of in their own minds, because we can hear the grid operator say these projects help with reliability, but then we can all think about wind and how it is variable, right? Some days it's not windy, and there's also a lot of disinformation out there that when the wind's not blowing, we have a problem on the grid. So it's that variability that sometimes can be hard for people to wrap their heads around. And so what I've found can be helpful is if we take a step back and we just think about the offshore wind resource and what it's sort of shaped like. And what I mean by that is if offshore wind were visible as a resource, it would look like mountain ranges all along the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast and a little bit in the Gulf. But there is so much energy off of our coasts in that offshore wind that it really would look just like the Rockies or something, but off the coast. And the highest peaks would be off of New England and New York. We just happen to be very well positioned there. And so if you'll bear with me, this is a mountain range. I was hoping to have a picture of Franconia Ridge or something more New Hampshire. If anyone can send me something that I could use, I would love that, the presidential range. But I think a lot of us are quite familiar with this idea of a mountain ridge. And this is sort of what the offshore wind resource actually looks like across time. So what I mean by that is that there's variability, right? Some days it's high wind, some days it's low wind, just like a ridge line. And that's sort of what critics point to. They say, well, it's not a straight line. But what that misses is this other much more important characteristic of the resource, and that is the scale, right? So when we think again about the White Mountains, where most people are not talking about how much variability there is along the ridgeline. They're talking about well, how high is it? Is it a 4,000 footer? Is it a 5,000 footer? So essentially, if offshore wind were a mountain, it would be, you know, these would be sort of really, really big mountains. And so hopefully that just gives people a more just basic feel for this. It's that, yes, it's a variable resource, but the reason that the grid operators like it, and the New York grid and the Mid-Atlantic grid, they also really like offshore wind. They like it because of the scale. These are large amounts of energy that can be delivered to the system. And so moving ahead now to our study, um, this um, this is a sample of the wind that we modeled from Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind. This was last winter, so this is from January of 2025. And you can see it loosely resembles a mountain range, right? There's all this variability. But looking on the vertical axis, you can see that that large scale. So these two projects together on many, many days in January would have been providing 1,000 megawatts, sometimes for days at a time. So that's what I mean when I say that these projects would be delivering large scale amounts of energy. And then just to sort of help connect the dots, there won't be too much math in this presentation, but just looking at one day in this period, January 15th, for example, these projects were at delivering 1,000 megawatts every hour all day. So that's 24 hours. 1,000 times 24 gives us 24,000 megawatt hours. Now that can just seem like a random fact. We have to put it into the bigger picture. And so we took this modeled energy and we put it into this bigger framework. So this is, again, from the ISO, the grid operator. This is one of the ways that they track the reliability of the grid. And by that, I mean, this is one of the ways they make sure that they can keep the lights on. This is a measure of total daily energy demand. So demand over 24-hour period. And you can see that as long as that total daily demand is below 350,000, that green zone, they are essentially, they're not worried. They know that there's enough supply in the system to meet the demand. The reason they track this so closely is because when it gets above 350,000, there starts to be a risk that there won't be enough supply to meet the demand. And when demand goes over 400,000 into this orange zone, the risk gets even higher. And that's just because energy is relatively scarce in New England in the winter. So we have trouble, I should say, in the summer, we are often in the red zone, and it's not actually a high risk situation. This applies much more to winter. So when demand is in these yellow and orange zones, or the red, we start to have a risk of a blackout. Now, this hasn't happened in New England, but the ISO does get it puts into place several emergency measures as this risk gets higher, because we have to keep supply to keeping up with demand, or they will have to reduce demand through rotating outages. And so, just thinking back to that slide from a moment ago, that 24,000 megawatt hours, you can sort of see how if we had that much supply on a particular day, it would actually help move this needle. We're looking at demand, but what we can do is subtract the supply, net it out, and see how much demand the grid operator would be trying to meet after taking that offshore wind into account. So that's essentially what we did in our study. We had the amount of wind energy that Vineyard and Revolution Wind would have produced every day of last winter. And we also had this demand number for every day of last winter. So we just simply mapped out both of them. So the last few slides in this section on reliability, you'll see these yellow and orange zones. we dropped out the green and red because green was sort of not relevant, and the red, we were fortunately not in the red zone last winter. So this is the 3-month period that this is how the ISO looks at winter. It's when reliability is the most concern. This is a 90-day period, and this is that daily demand last winter. And you can see that for more than half of that period, we were actually at an elevated or higher risk of a blackout, meaning this demand was over 350,000. I think 4 days, it was over 400,000. So 53 days in this more elevated zone. And the way I was describing it earlier today that seemed to resonate with people is if you are responsible for operating the grid, this yellow zone is sort of a period when you would have a mild headache, and the orange zone is when you would have a migraine. Essentially, it's a higher stress for the grid, it's higher stress for the people who are trying to keep the lights on. So we really want to stay out of these zones. And as I said, then we just simply subtracted the offshore wind energy that we would have had to see how that would change this picture. And so this is this blue line shows how things would have been different if we'd had just those two projects online. You can see it makes a big difference. It actually cuts the days with risk by more than half. And you can see that if you look sort of towards late January, early February, you can see there were many days when the system would have been in the yellow zone, and it's pulled out of that by that extra energy. And so it doesn't, there is the variability. It doesn't reduce risk on every single day, but over the course of the season, it reduced about 50% or 55% of the risk. And then this is what it looks like, or what it would have looked like if we had had two more projects online. Some people in the audience who might be tracking this are probably aware there are two additional projects that could come online in New England after these first two. And this is what the system would look like. You can see only 13 days with elevated risk. So this is what we mean when we say offshore wind makes the grid stronger. It really lowers the risk, lowers the stress on the system. And those are the results. I think the next section is affordability. Okay, these are just want to make sure that everyone has the links to our studies and then is aware that we'll be coming out with an update. And I just wanted to touch base, Reinmar, would it make sense to pause here for questions, or should I go into the affordability?
Well, sure. If you feel like pausing, do we have questions in the chat? I guess we've got a couple here. Um, let's see. The first one is about affordability, so let's look at that later. Chris says winter wind is nice, but I think local grid outages are from above ground lines caused by trees, ice, weather. Trees/ice/weather. Thus, prices go up overall, but less than we'd expect. So I guess that's a more of a question about delivery, right?
Yes, absolutely. There are local outages from exactly the physical power lines, failure of equipment. Yes, the kind of blackout that we are talking about and that the ISO is most worried about it's a different type. It's essentially the system as a whole running out of fuel. You can I think about it as the difference between maybe the windshield on your car, windshield wiper breaking. That's like a local power line being down, versus the car running out of gas or running out of charge if it were electric car. So yes, there are different reasons for outages, but offshore wind helps with the sort of big picture total energy in the system.
Hmm. People are breaking through the shy barrier, and they're and they're putting a lot of questions in the chat here. Is offshore wind being installed in coastal New Hampshire and Maine? So I guess that's about those two that you mentioned, you didn't say where they were. Where are they?
Oh,
They're
the
not finished
additional.
yet, but yeah.
Yes, those two. So there's their names are the South Coast Wind and New England Wind One. Those are also in southern New England. So as people are probably aware, all of these projects are being built on the outer continental shelf. And so this is why the federal government plays a very important role. And there are essentially there's a southern New England area where these four projects are. And then there's a northern New England area in the Gulf of Maine that has also been mapped out. So the four that we studied are in the southern area.
Because they're farther along in development.
That's right. There's also the the area that in southern New England is sort of the premium spot to build. It's the shallowest water, so we can have fixed instead of floating offshore wind, which is much more affordable.
Yeah, that was going to be my question actually, is that the reason why the northern New England sites are, coming along later?
Mhm. Yes,
Yeah,
that's a big part of it. Yeah.
great. Then we have a couple more questions I think we can address later about the lease buyback termination issues that we talked about before we got started. But I think you'll get to that as we go along, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, it's still sort of people are still examining the legality. So
Yeah.
even my thoughts. I'm a lawyer by training, so I think, I think there's a lot still to be understood. But yes, happy to talk about that too.
And I will mention that these slides will be available if that's okay with you, Susan. I guess I didn't actually ask you,
Yeah.
so people can get it from our website or from any of us. And if you want to download those links, if you want to get them, you will be able to. Everyone will have access. Great, thanks, Susan.
Great. All right, so I will just move on here, and this is actually I think the issue that is probably, well, I think reliability is very important, right? We need the lights to stay on, but people sort of on a day-to-day basis are really increasingly worried about affordability. And so offshore wind can make a very big difference here. There's been a lot of mis and disinformation. So I will briefly explain how it makes a difference, but I want to be clear that this is it's it's a fairly complex subject. We have a short animation that helps explain how the energy market works, and I will try to drop that in the chat. But also so I want to recommend that. But I'll just try to cover some of the top line messages here. So back to the Blue Mountain Range, as I think about it, this is again just the energy from January of last year that we would have had with these two offshore wind projects. And so everything in blue again is energy, and these are large amounts of energy being delivered to New England. Um, but the important thing to know about this energy is that it is very low operating cost. And that's because these projects are making electricity from fuel that is free, right? They don't have to pay for the wind. And so the projects are expensive to build. That is absolutely true. And that is what the contracts are really about. They're about the developers need to recoup those construction costs over these long-term contracts. But once they're built, they essentially have a near zero operating cost. And so what we're looking at when the energy market looks at this energy, it sees a lot of near zero cost energy. And that's important because the price in the energy market is set by operating costs. So this and that's the first bullet here. This market price is driven by operating costs. Now I've underlined the word market because it is only one part of the picture. The contract price for offshore wind is the other part of the picture. And what has happened in the public conversation is that everyone's been focused on the contract cost and no one's been thinking about the energy market. And we really need to think about them both because they both affect our electric bills. Um, but what I will say is that the omission of the market impact is very unfortunate because it is actually a much bigger piece of your energy bill. If you think about, in fact, this slide is showing an example from the market. In any given hour, 10 to 20,000 megawatt hours of energy are being bought and sold. And so whatever the market price is being paid to 10 or 20,000 10 or 20,000 megawatt hours. So that price is being applied to a very large quantity of energy. And it is the same price for all the energy in the market. That's another thing that can be a little tricky. Our animation may be helpful in understanding that. But when we think about the contract cost, that is only applied to one project. So Vineyard Wind is 800 megawatts, or Revolution, for example, Connecticut ratepayers are paying for only 300 megawatts of power. So the contract price applies to 300 megawatts, but the benefits that I'm going to be talking about, these savings, apply to 10, 20,000 megawatts. So this is, it's very abstract, but just to keep in mind that there are two sides to the ledger, and one of them has much larger quantity in it. So very briefly, how does offshore wind lower the market price? It's what we are looking at here on the right. It essentially walks us through this. This is, the technical term is a supply stack, but it really is just a supply curve. If you think about Econ 101, this is what the grid operator, or so the ISO operates the grid and operates the market. So it's what the ISO sees in any given hour. You can see this was hour ending 12. So this was the hour between 11 and noon on January 19th, 2025. These were the actual set of offers to sell energy in New England during this hour. And like any supply curve, the further out you go to the right in terms of quantity, the higher the price. And so thinking back to that offshore wind being low, near zero cost, it essentially allows the grid operator and the market to back away and walk down the supply curve and essentially not have to use those more expensive power plants and not pay that higher price. So you can see here, moving from this red circle to the green circle, essentially moving down the supply curve results in a reduction in the price. You can see over on the vertical axis, the price is moving from somewhere around maybe $125, $120 per megawatt hour down to 100. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that that lowers the price. So offshore wind is coming in. This is happening actually as we speak. We're getting energy, very low operating cost energy from these offshore wind projects right now. And it's pushing some of the most expensive power plants out of the energy market. And it's lowering that market price. And these are just the sort of the top line findings from this study, which there's a link to it on the bottom here. So I recommend if anyone wants to see the detailed results. But they modeled essentially the same fleet of 4 projects that we modeled during the same time period last winter. And they found overall a downward movement in that market price of 11%, which is really significant. It's essentially saying, look, if you looked at your energy bill, just saying offshore wind would have given you an 11% discount for the winter months on your supply costs. And that adds up because, again, the quantities are so large. So $400 million in savings, sort of the result of that movement in the market price. And so I'm going to wrap up here, but what I will say is that we we need to put these savings alongside the contract costs, and they do need to be taken as a whole. And that's what the authors of this study, Daymark, did that for, I think it was for Eversource customers in Massachusetts to see with these savings and the contract costs, how did that net out? And they found, as you might expect, the savings were so significant that Massachusetts customers still benefited. There was a net benefit after the contract costs. And I will mention, Susan and I were just talking about this earlier. In New Hampshire, we are not paying contract costs, but we are getting these market price reductions. So we are getting all the benefits and not paying any of the costs, which certainly benefits us. But it is worth thinking about whether whether it might be collectively in the interest of everyone in New England to share these costs because the benefits in the savings are so great. Then we could all have a net benefit. And I think that is my last slide. So just wrapping up, as we talked about, it's this strong addition of energy supply in the winter that really makes a difference for reliability. We see the grid operator saying that, and our study of this past winter and all previous winters show this very consistently. And then on affordability, this is the part of the story that has not been shared widely enough. Offshore wind will always put downward pressure on the wholesale market price because of the way the energy market works. And again, I'll try to drop that animation in the chat. But that's a very important benefit that is going to start showing up on everyone's electric bills, but it is not talked about very often. And
Great. Thank you very much, Susan Muller. So grateful to you for making the time to go through some of this stuff with us. There are questions populating the chat. Let's see, John and Susan, if you see some that you think would be really good to start off with, let me know. Actually, as long as we're talking about affordability, Paul asked, what is to prevent the wind company from raising its bid price to bank more profit? So I guess that has to do with the contract price, right?
yeah, so the contract prices are actually set. So they do not, they increase, I think, gradually over the year, and they can be adjusted for inflation, but they are essentially negotiated at the beginning and do not change.
Mm-hmm.
Reimer, I have a good question here. Owner asked, um, they're sorry to be so self-centered, but if New Hampshire is getting cost benefits without contract costs, what is the motivation to employ offshore energy locally? Can we just free ride, I guess?
I guess, yeah, no, that's a great question. And as I said, I mean, I live in New Hampshire and right, it seems like why would we want to help with the costs? I guess the reason is because we see that the industry is facing some severe headwinds, and of course there are political headwinds that is a different story. Um, but um, but it really could make a difference. We could have much more offshore wind if we were all, it's sort of like if we all pitched in, we could actually have much more of this. And if you think about that graph with the risk going down and that downward pressure on market price, we could have those benefits many times over if we all joined in.
Yeah, and I assume there's local job benefits also. If you're bringing the power in, there's local jobs to benefit from.
Absolutely. Yes, there we had a very powerful talk this morning from Matt Gavin, who the iron workers. These are really good jobs working on these projects, and a lot of people in New England were benefiting from that, buying their first homes. And so, yeah, those are also very important benefits that would come to New Hampshire.
And then a follow up on that. So can you tie this to a person's personal energy bill we get it from Eversource or something. They have a contract rate for 6 months that's a specified rate. So all of the stuff is going on in the background. How does that relate to what we're actually paying per kilowatt hour?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And, I will just say it's extremely complicated. So I'm simplifying. But you're absolutely right. Eversource, they essentially buy energy through middlemen, but they buy it on the wholesale market. And so they are always keeping an eye on where is that wholesale market price going. As you can imagine, with events in the Middle East right now, that a lot of people are expecting those market prices to go up. And so Eversource, they do have to sort of do some forecasting, but they essentially they try to predict what the price of wholesale power will be, and then they set a rate so that they can recover that from all of us. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Anne asks, I think, a valid question, which is, it sounds great. Are there downsides to offshore wind? And I think I would supplement that perhaps by asking about the wind speed data, because winter, I can see that there's a lot of wind in the winter over the ocean. There's also storms, and so we didn't mention the other jargon, which is resilience. How about the resilience of the grid in during winter storms and that kind of thing? Is that an issue? Has it been an issue? Are there data from Europe about that, for instance?
Let's see. Yes, I will say I'm not very familiar with the data from Europe, but what we know is that these projects have what's called a cutout speed. And that means when wind speed, I think when it gets above 25 meters per second, which is about 55 miles per hour. These projects they actually have to shut down and feather their blades essentially to protect the equipment from damage. And so you're absolutely right. There are weather patterns where the wind is above 55 miles per hour, for example, and where the ISO has done this modeling too, where we would see a period, it could be a few hours or a few days of cutout, but they're fairly rare. And this comes up more with as we go down, for example, the Atlantic coast, the hurricane risk becomes much higher, and so that sort of risk calculus tends to weigh against a massive build out of offshore wind. But still, these projects, they have been, I think, typhoon and hurricane proofed. I mean, they are very resilient in themselves. But I think sort of maybe the most important point is, yeah, there will be periods where we actually lose energy, but they're very infrequent because of high wind speeds. On the other end is the cut in speed. Sometimes the wind is so low that the projects there will be periods where they are not generating energy just because the wind speed is so low. Those are also very infrequent. But again, the grid operator has studied them. And we sort of over the big picture, there are stochastic probabilistic studies of sort of how frequent is this. And it turns out to be very low probability, still something that we need to plan around. And so the grid operator's approach is to just make sure that we always have a portfolio of resources so that we would not want the whole grid to run just on offshore wind. But sorry, I think I skipped over the original question, which was, are there any downsides? And absolutely, yes. These projects do impact the natural ecosystems when they are being constructed. That is real. What we are hearing is that there's a lot of resilience in these systems once the construction is over. That they're seeing a lot of the fish are returning. Even the turbines are creating artificial reefs, and fishing is reported to be good around these projects. I'm not an expert on those impacts, but certainly the many experts have weighed in on the sort of the safe construction of these projects. And I'd say the other, it's not a downside, but it is a difficulty, is that these projects are expensive to build. There's no getting around that. And so we need to, there's a lot of more work to do to lower those costs. But we actually, the industry can see a pathway to reducing costs because we are starting to onshore a lot of the construction. The Oceanic, which is looks at the supply chain, they just came out with a great report that I can send a link to. But we have steel factories in the United States that can now manufacture the kind of steel that these projects need. And even doing that will should start to reduce costs. And we now have American vessels that can help with construction. So a lot of these things are going to lower costs and help with that issue.
Yeah, the production and siting of these facilities used to depend on ships from Denmark and stuff, right? I think, is that correct?
Exactly. Yes. And when we think about, the economic benefits, we now have a lot of shipbuilding in the Gulf. So Louisiana and Texas, I think it was hundreds of people worked on building some of the vessels that will now be used in future projects and that are currently being used. And so, yes, originally with the very first projects, everything was sort of brought over from Europe, but that's starting to change.
And has the steel industry changed or tweaked its processes specifically for this reason?
Yes, yes, and that's
Huh.
exactly what this Oceanic study or announcement is about. Yeah, there are several. I think it's in Kentucky and Ohio in particular. And I think I am not an expert, a materials expert, but it is a very strong type of steel that these projects need. And yes, they have modified their processes and are now going to be able to do that. And so the opportunity from the steel industry is really massive. And there are actually a lot of investors that are very excited about that.
Mhm.
Reinmar, I
Great.
have two affordability
Yes.
questions here. Paul asks, in the competition of providing electricity, what is to prevent the wind company from raising its bid price to bank more profit? I guess it's just the general
Oh, actually, we
economics.
covered that one already,
Oh,
John.
I'm sorry.
You were
Can you
doing
go?
something else.
Moving on. Could you compare offshore wind development in New England with advanced and small modular nuclear in terms of scale as well as timelines to get operational and maybe price?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I could say the clearest difference between the two is the timeline, right? I think that small modular reactors, from from what I've seen, obviously I'm not an expert in that technology, but I don't think anyone expects those to be able to come online before 2035. So we're talking about a decade, whereas offshore wind is available now. Um, the price, again, I am not an expert at, but I think it's an unknown that there are some data points, but there there is a concern that it could be very expensive. And then there is not insignificant concern about the safety. My colleague Ed Lyman at UCS has been tracking sort of the dismantling of some of the regulatory safeguards. And so I'd say that if the regulatory safeguards were in place, we would be less concerned. But we're not seeing the safety safeguards, and so there are concerns about price and safety. And then the biggest thing I think is that the that would not be energy that we could count on for at least 10 years.
There was an ISO New England user group meeting this morning, and one of the graphs showed how much it will cost to get to net zero. And they said the last 15% of the way would be very expensive because that's when nuclear started coming into to fill in the final needs.
Yes, yeah, I was actually just looking at that study, and yeah, it's uh, for the purposes of time, I won't go into too much detail, but I will say that that the study it may have exaggerated the size of the problem, which is meeting the winter peak. There are a lot of ways to have a lower winter peak, and it may also have, I won't say deliberately ignored, but it did not consider many alternative solutions that may be more affordable. So, for example, like distributed virtual power plants. But yes, yeah, I think we need to do the research and look at the options. But when we look at what we have right now with offshore wind, it's just it offers so many important benefits in the near term that it's really hard to see it being interfered with.
Great. I'm just in a minute or two going to ask my colleague Susan Richmond to catch us up on stuff that's coming up on our New Hampshire network. But I want to end with one question from Representative Wendy Thomas, who's one of our uh, climate and environment champions in New Hampshire, a state representative. She asks, during testimony, we heard from many fishermen who said that offshore wind was going to affect their yield. And of course, we heard about the mythical death of whales. So I think it would not be, it would be amiss if we didn't end up by talking a little bit about these issues of, in biological impact, ecological impact, and also on fishermen's livelihoods, just in a few sentences.
Sure. And with the caveat that I'm not a biologist, a marine biologist. But yeah, that came up this morning too. And what people who have worked on these projects have said is that really it would be good for these fishermen to go visit the operating sites because the reality is that that there is that the fish seem to be actually coming back abundantly. That sort of that the real world impact seems to be much uh, much less adverse than feared. It's there are impacts though, and I think it's just important to get the actual facts. Some of it is misinformation, and the other big picture issue is the impact on fisheries of climate change, right? We see even just if you think about lobsters in Maine moving north and moving out of Maine because of the warming waters. The offshore wind is going to help slow that and keep those resources from shifting. So I'd say it's a much more complicated story, and the impacts are not as negative as has been presented.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Susan Muller. It's really great to have you with us, and we're very grateful to get your insights in some of the detail on this report, and looking forward to the next one. And I guess the data is not showing huge change. So
Yes, yeah. If anything, the benefits were even greater this past winter. So I will share that with you for sharing out to the network. And I did also want to mention I'm going to be presenting the same study, but we'll also hear from another expert on energy markets and offshore wind on April 15th. So I'll share the link for that, but it'll be a webinar that UCS and the New England for Offshore Wind Network are sponsoring.
great, and we'll have some publicity coming out for that as well in the near future. And Susan, do you want to tell us about what else is happening on the network?
Okay. So, um, first of all, yes, we will be letting you know about what's happening on April 15th. And uh-oh, I need to get this to move. Uh, You know what? I don't have that much for anyone to look at, and it's not being cooperative. Let me say mostly New Hampshire Network exists to get information out to people about the environment, that it is hard to come by or hard to know what you can trust. And hopefully you will tune in to us. During the legislative season, we have a spreadsheet that we speak with legislators like Wendy Thomas to find recommendations of what is good, and giving you the explanation of how you can testify. We also have events like this every month, and we also have working groups, one that supports energy committees in our municipalities, but anyone can join. You don't have to belong to an energy committee discussing energy specifically. There is a climate group that is talking about what we can do nationally and to match up more with global energy pricing, carbon pricing. And then there's a plastics working group. So we try to work on many levels, and we're not rigid. If you have some ideas of what we should do differently or more, please come help us make them happen. And that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Both Susans. Thank you, both Susans,
Thank you,
very much.
Irene. Thanks for having me.
And we'll be in touch. Thank you, and thank you all for being with us and joining. Hope you join us again next week, next month when we have our next webinar.